Good morning. My name is Allison Arnold. I'm the Agriculture Extension Agent here with Buncombe County Cooperative Extension, and I'll be your host today. I want to welcome you to Gardening in the Mountains, 4-Season Trees and Shrubs for Western North Carolina Gardens. Our program today is presented by Ralph Coffey. 23 years ago, Ralph purchased a bed and breakfast in Asheville. There were very few shrubs, nothing very interesting. It was truly a landscaping blank slate. Ralph wanted guests to come and stay all 4 seasons, so he wanted the grounds to be interesting and inviting during all those 4 seasons that we're so blessed to have here in the Asheville area. He began planting what he calls 4-season plants, and he began a new journey. After a while, he began planting those in his personal garden as well. Then when the Learning Gardens here at their office here on Mount Carmel Road started 3 years ago, it was natural for Ralph to help start a 4-season garden for us. And we were really, really glad he did. Ralph brings us years of research and practice, and he is truly a master gardener for all seasons. Please take it away, Ralph.
Why should we be interested in 4-season trees and shrubs? A plant whose only interest is 2 weeks of bloom each year might take up just as much space in the garden as one with multiple seasons of interest. Plants of multiple seasons of interest help create garden diversity and year-round interest. Plants of multiple seasons of interest also add more value to a landscape, and this becomes important as gardens get smaller. 4-season interest trees and shrubs. What are we looking for? We're looking for beautiful foliage, attractive bark, fruit display and seed heads, the overall habit of the plant, the architecture of the trees and shrubs in winter, and the beauty of the flower buds and the structure of the flowerscapes and inflorescences. The first tree we're going to talk about is Gateworthia chrysanthemum, or paperbush. This is an amazing tree that has incredible winter interest. And we also have a tree that's very fragrant. The paperbush begins blooming in December, and it continues throughout winter. And like a Daphne, which it's related to, you can smell this long before you can see it. Gateworthia thrives in partial shade, but will grow in full sun. And in spring, as the bloom passes, this gives you a really good shot of what it looks like in full bloom. It sports bluish foliage with silver undertones. It has a beautiful shape and form. And in autumn, the leaves turn a rich shade of yellow. The shrub grows fairly rapidly to 7 feet high and wide, particularly striking in winter, when the buds look almost like small Christmas ornaments decorating the shrub. It's also a very fast-growing shrub and is easily controlled by severe pruning, and it will come right back. Our next shrub we're looking at is Hydrangea quercifolia, the oak leaf hydrangea. This is a deciduous native shrub that grows easily in moist, well-drained soil, and it will grow in full sun to partial shade. It typically grows 4 to 6 feet upright, rounded multi-stem shrub, and noted for producing white panicles in the summer. Also, you see interesting structure, exfoliating bark, very pollinator attractive shrub. You see a lot of bees collecting on it. Beautiful fall color. The leaves turn a bright scarlet, and you can also see the dried panicles that persist through winter. So this does give you a lot of winter interest. Now, do we have any questions?
Ralph, we had one in the chat box regarding anytime you can mention whether the plant is native, when we wrap up. I did send the link to the Extension Gardener Toolbox that people can go to look up more about the plants. And that is all I see in the chat box for questions.
Okay, Allison, we're going to talk a little bit more now about the Edgeworthia. And I wanted to bring this slide back up so we can actually look at it up close. Edgeworthia is not a native. It was introduced from China about 15 years ago. And I'm one of these typical plant geeks that when there's a new plant introduced, I have to have it. So I ended up finding one locally and planted it in my garden at the White Gate. It's supposedly a Zone 7 plant, but I watched it through the years, and we did have winters where it got down to 5 degrees, and this plant was absolutely fine. It's one of the earliest plants to bloom. You can, depending on the weather patterns, you can see blooms even in February and March. And what is really interesting about the design of the bud is that you can have a hard freeze and it will take out some of the small flowers on the edge of the bud, but it doesn't damage the buds in the center. So you have a warm spell again, and then it continues to bloom. So you can literally have blooms from, gosh, December on a warm day through early April. The one thing about this type of shrub is because of its fragrance, you really want it where you can appreciate it, whether it's close to your walkway, close to your porch. This way you can appreciate the blooms, and you can also appreciate these incredible buds. The downside of having it close to your house is that it grows fast, and all of a sudden it can be too big. So a good example is probably every 3 years or so, I do a heavy pruning, normally in April, right after it's finished blooming. And this past year, I cut it in half. The one at my house was probably 7 feet by 7 feet. So now it's back to 4 feet. So I did this in April, and then I'm observing now that I'm seeing the buds for next year's bloom. They tend to start forming in August. And the other thing that I really like about this particular shrub is that it forms suckers at the base of the plant. And what I tend to do is I let the suckers get maybe a foot tall, and in April or May, I'll go in with a sharp instrument and separate these suckers from the mother plant and pot them up. And I have a pretty good success rate with this, and they do really grow fast. One of my original suckers is now growing in the Four Seasons garden at the office, and it's only about 3 feet tall, and it has buds on it for next year. The other thing about this particular plant is that when you go into a nursery, and we all need our winter fix because we've gotten bored and we want to see plants, so we go to the nurseries in February or March, and they always have these, and they sell out fast because of how interesting the plant looks with these buds getting ready to open up. And then the one other thing I would make a comment on is I've grown these in wet conditions and dry conditions, and they adapt to both. So it really is a plant that goes on quite easily. Okay, I'm going to talk now about the oak leaf hydrangea. And one thing I wanted to talk about, I think in the original notes, I mentioned how this can grow, 6 or 7 feet by 6 or 7 feet. This is the species oak leaf hydrangea. But what you need to know is that the plant hybridizers have done a lot of work with this to reduce the size. So you've got variations of oak leaf hydrangea that will only get 3 or 4 feet tall. The question that so many people have about hydrangeas is it relates to pruning. And I think rule of thumb, whether it's a hydrangea or another blooming shrub, is if you need to prune it for whatever reasons, prune it right after it blooms. And that way you're not as concerned as to whether you're going to keep the blooms, keep this plant from blooming the following season. one thing that the plant breeders are doing with hydrangea, and you can see this in the learning garden, is they're creating smaller plants, smaller hydrangeas that are more upright, and you don't have the floppy blooms that so many hydrangeas tend to have. We have a number of varieties that were donated by the Mountain Horticultural Research Center, and they were planted in the Four Seasons garden along the border about 2 years ago. They've done extremely well. These are all Tom Rainey introductions, and they are available in most nurseries. The only other thing I wanted to say about the hydrangeas is we got a lot of questions about lack of bloom. I think 2 out of the last 5 years, we had a late freeze in Western North Carolina, and depending on your elevations, it really did a lot of damage to the hydrangeas, and you didn't see that much bloom that particular year. And my advice always is don't go in and just start pruning. Wait and see what new growth may come back out, and then, deal with it then. One other thing I like to mention about the hydrangeas is that if you're worried about pruning, doing it at the wrong time, there's a great series called Endless Summer that blooms on the new wood and the old wood, so that you don't really tend to make the mistakes of when to prune and when not to prune. Okay, we're going to go on to our next series.
Great, thank you, Ralph.
Unless we have other questions.
What was the name of the last hydrangea that you named? Oh, was it?
Summer is a series of hydrangeas. They were developed a few years ago, and the main reason for these, they come in various colors, but the blooms occur on the old wood and the new wood.
Okay. There's a question to see if you give tours at the end of your garden.
Yes, we've done a number of tours over the last 22 years, both conifer related and Japanese maple related and four-season interest plants. So yes, we still give tours.
And I would just like to add that the Learning Garden is also available for touring. We are in the garden on Monday and Wednesday mornings. And of course, people are always invited to come and visit the gardens, and master gardeners are in the gardens working on Monday and Wednesday mornings and can be available as well. So there is a question just to keep in mind is, and the next follow-up is these plants that are deer resistant. Any experience with deer, Ralph, that you can include, moving forward? So.
Certainly.
Okay, thank you.
Now we have one of my favorite slow growing trees that you really don't see as much in the landscape as you should. It can be a small tree or a large shrub. It's one of the earliest trees to bloom. So it creates habitat for the pollinators when anything else is in bloom. It can start blooming in February. You see clusters of small, bright yellow flowers that persist for several weeks. And then you have an amazing show of glossy red cherry-like fruit in midsummer. And if the wildlife doesn't get to the fruit, it is edible and it can be canned and used for syrups and preserves. The bushy, small flowering tree sports oval dark green leaves, which actually turn purple in the fall, which is a really unusual fall effect before shedding. And then you see this incredible rough, rich brown exfoliating bark. Our next shrub is Aronia or red chokeberry. This is a really tough plant with four-season interest. It can be a fairly tall, multi-stemmed, semi-evergreen shrub. And in spring, you see a profusion of white to light pink flower clusters that appear along the branches. The foliage is glossy dark green, and it turns brilliant red and fall. Abundant clusters of red berries persist well into winter. So it gives you a lot of winter interest along with the structure. Chunk berries are very easy to grow. They form colonies fairly fast, and they actually adapt to both wet and dry conditions. Excellent choice for the naturalistic plants. Another real interesting shrub that you rarely see is Sephorocarpus or coralberry. What I like about the coralberry, in addition to the blooms that you see, sort of pinkish white flowers that appear in summer along the stems, is that coralberry forms thickets very, very rapid. So it's a great native shrub for slopes, steep slopes, to stabilize the landscape. What's really interesting about these berries, or drupes as they're called, they mature in autumn and they persist through winter. For whatever reasons, birds are not really attracted that much to these berries, and you'll be looking at these all the way through winter, well into spring. Chokeberry, again, is native both to wet and dry thickets and can form sizable colonies, so it's also an excellent form of naturalistic landscape. Our next tree is Stewardia pseudocamellia, or the Japanese Stewardia. You can see by this photograph why it's called the pseudocamellia, because the blooms are very similar to camellia-like blooms. Stewardia is a beautiful tree for this whole landscape. I've actually been growing this tree in my own garden for almost 20 years, and it's still only about 12 feet tall and 4 feet wide. Stewardia has beautiful saucer-shaped white flowers with orange centers. Blooms in early summer, and then the dark green leaves turn a beautiful orange red in the autumn. And then as the tree matures, you have a beautiful patchwork of pink, reddish brown, and gray that develops on the bark along the trunk and branches. And then they give you even more winter interest. The seed pods are very interesting and persist on the tree throughout winter, adding to the four-season interest. There's also a native Stewardia that's called Stewardia malacodendron, which is known as the silky camellia. And this is the native Stewardia that actually grows in deep shade in the south. Do we have any questions that have come up?
Yeah, Ralph, we have a couple in the chat box. Let's see. I believe it's the coralberry. Is that in what kind of sun conditions does it prefer?
Coralberry, I've grown it for probably 20 years at the end, and it's growing in full sun, partial shade, but to really form the berry count like it does, I would recommend full sun. The other thing that I would mention about it is the flowers are fairly insignificant. It tends to bloom midsummer, but when you look at it, the number of pollinators that you find are just amazing. You'll see wasp, bees, flies covering the coralberry. And then it really does form colonies rapidly. I did see a question about where can you find it. You just have to do your research, Google it, see if there's local availability. And what I'd also like to mention is I did find it locally years ago, but most of the nurseries here are perfectly willing to find something for you and order it if they don't have it in stock. So just feel free to just ask about it. Were there any other questions? I'm going to go back and talk about the cornelian cherry dogwood, if not.
Yeah, let's hear about the cornelian cherry.
Yeah, this is a tree that I discovered probably 20 years ago, local nursery, didn't know anything about it. It is one of the earliest trees to bloom in the spring. And again, the buds are designed so that you can have bloom in February, a hard freeze, and you'll still see it bloom in March or April. Late frosts don't seem to bother the flower buds. The cherries are actually not really cherries. They're called cornels, and it's sort of a first cousin of the American dogwood. But when you Google this particular tree, you find that the fruit has a large, loyal culinary following since ancient times, really based on the floral sweetness of the syrups and the drinks and puddings and confections are made from it. It's obviously super hardy if it's a native of the Black Sea area, and it even thrives in Siberia, where Russians turn the cherries into wine and then add the cherries to vodka. Cornelian cherry preserves are eaten as well, and it tends to be a luxury sweet served with black tea. So the other side of this, and I had the best production this year of these fruits that I've ever had, and I had harvested some, and then of course we have a lot of bear activity in our neighborhood, and they did harvest the rest of the berries, but luckily they didn't really damage the tree. It is a fairly small growing tree. There are actually two different cultivars. One is more upright and one tends to spread a little bit more, but it's an incredible four-season tree from the standpoint of flowers, fruit, and then this incredible exfoliating bark as you visualize in winter. Okay, were there any other questions that came in, Allison? We move on to the next segment.
Someone asked about the Cornelian dogwood being native or not?
No, it is not native. It is a cousin of our native dogwoods, but it is not a native tree. And again, when I'm looking for four-season interest, I'm looking for native and non-native, depending on the attraction of pollinators. I've been a beekeeper for about 5 years, and so when I look at the landscape, I'm looking for things that are blooming early, February, March, when there's very little available for the bees. And if I find a non-native that works well in the landscape and as a pollinator attractor, I don't really get too hung up on whether it's native or non-native.
I see this one listed on many plant lists for unusual fruit, you know, for people that are useful fruit kind of trees and shrubs. Ralph, we have a question. Would this be suitable in part sun or shade conditions if you don't have a full sun condition?
It will grow well in part shade. You won't get as high a fruit count, but I think, you know, most of these trees and shrubs that we're talking about were growing in full sun in the learning garden, and they've adapted very well, but most of them will also adapt to part sun.
Mm-hmm. And then finally, someone's asked about diseases. Are there common diseases on this dogwood?
You know, this dogwood is not affected by the anthracnose that affects our native dogwoods. I've seen very little problems with it at all when it comes to disease.
Yeah, it's noted to be very borer and anthracnose resistant, so which is very important for us in our area. Do you need more than one dogwood to get good fruiting?
No, you don't. You know, one, it'll self-pollinate, so you don't need to worry about having a second.
Okay, great. And then finally, we've had a couple of questions or comments in the chat box around bears and berries. And the question here is, in your long years of experience, have you had more bear activity in your gardens with your fruiting plants?
The answer would be yes, simply because I live in a neighborhood where literally our protocol for landscaping tells you to avoid trees that bear fruit or nuts. You can choose to ignore that in your neighborhood, but there's so much bear activity. Literally last night, I watched Mama and 3 cubs wander through the back of our property. I think I've learned through the years not to get as upset as I used to be when damage occurs, because we're in their territory, and providing extra nutrition for them through a tree that we may have planted. I don't really see that as a negative. I've also learned that bears do not walk around your plant materials. They just walk through them. So it's not unusual to walk out in your garden and see damage, whether it's to something that has nuts or berries or fruit, or even to a conifer. The problem I tend to see is not with the adult bears as much as when they have cubs that are a year or 2 years old, because they get pretty frisky and they like to run up and down trees, and you do tend to see damage, but I don't get as upset as I did 5 years ago. I just accept it.
All right, great. Okay, that's it. Thank you, Ralph. Let's move on.
Our next tree, and I really would include this as one of my favorites, is crepe myrtle natchez. Natchez is a white blooming small tree with this incredible bark that's smooth, dark cinnamon brown, exfoliating bark. It has dark green, glossy leaves that turn a bright vibrant orange red in fall. And then the panicles of soft textured flowers that blooms all summer and attracts many species of bees. Interesting thing about this particular crepe myrtle is how much it does attract pollinators. The pink and purple and red crepe myrtles, you rarely see the insect activity on them, but when you look at natchez, it's always covered with bees, and it gives you really long seeds. And on the left, obviously, we see what the seed pods look like in winter, so that's obvious winter interest. The structure of the crepe myrtle itself, whether it's natchez or any other crepe myrtle, is great if you just allow it to form its natural structure. There seems to be this persistent philosophy that you have to go in and prune crepe myrtles severely. I mean, there are ways to prune conservatively so that the tree keeps its structure and doesn't get crepe murdered, as we like to say, when you see crepe myrtles that have been mishandled when it comes to pruning. Just let it achieve its natural form. Now we have vitex, or chase shrub. This is an amazing large shrub, small grown tree that has large terminal clusters of fragrant violet colored blooms, aromatic gray green foliage. It's naturally broad and spreading, has an open habit, multi-trunks. You can train it as a shrub, you can keep it as a large shrub, or you can actually let it grow to a tree size. The flowers are very attractive to species of butterflies and bees. Lasts for quite some time. Also, it's a great alternative to butterfly bush. The chase tree is just as showy as the butterfly bush, but it's not invasive. You have these wonderful seed pods that persist through winter. Our next tree is Magnolia virginiana, or the sweet-mayed magnolia. This is a native tree to the southeastern United States. This is the largest growing tree that we're talking about today. It can grow up to 15 or 20 feet tall. Typically it grows as a tree, but it can be converted to a multi-stem shrub. The blooms of the sweet-mayed magnolia are fairly small. They're only 2 to 3 inches in diameter. They appear in mid-spring, and they only last for 2 or 3 days. But the nice thing about this native magnolia is that it will bloom sporadically through the summer. And it is semi-evergreen. It will lose some leaves in fall, but it does keep a lot of its leaves. And to give it its four-season interest, it forms these beautiful cone-like fruits with bright red seeds that mature in the fall and give it that winter interest. And the structure of the sweet-mayed magnolia is also very winter. Our next shrub that we're going to talk about is clethra ruby spice, or sweet pepper bush. It's a wonderful deciduous native shrub that will grow 3 to 6 feet tall very rapidly. And it spreads very rapidly to form nice colonies. Bloom period clethra is mid to late summer, and it does form pinkish red flowers. There's also a native that is pure white. This is the one that is actually called ruby spice. And clethra is very attractive to butterflies and bees. In the fall, it has beautiful shades of yellow foliage. Clethra ruby spice, or any clethra, grows really well in full sun worship. It quickly spreads to form colonies, so it's great for stabilizing slopes and controlling erosion. In summary, for what we've talked about today, all of these trees and shrubs can grow in full sun to part shade. In the learning garden, they all grow in full sun, so they will adapt to full sun. The important thing is that they need to be established, and really it'll take a couple of years paying attention to your plants to make sure that they're established. And once they are established, they're pretty drought tolerant. A lot of the plants we talked about today are fragrant, and all of the trees and shrubs we've talked about are pollinated plants. They attract various types of pollinators. Bees, wasps, flies. We're obviously talking about bees a lot, but they do attract a wide range of insects, and obviously also butterflies. Now, when you talk about cultivars versus straight species, a good example is the clethra ruby spice. That is a cultivar, a very specific type of clethra. So you want to do your research and see what the straight species is versus the cultivar. Cultivars tend to be improved variations of the species that may involve different flowers, bigger flowers. Cultivars may be developed to shrink the size of the plant. So it's a good example. Instead of having the hydrangea that can be 6 to 8 feet across and 6 feet tall, they may shrink it to 3 or 4 feet. So you just need to do your research and see the potential of the plant. And some of the plants we talked about today are, I wouldn't necessarily say rare, but they may be more difficult to find. But most of our local nurseries can supply these plants. So don't be hesitant to ask if there's a particular plant that you're interested in. You can definitely ask about it and see if they can find it for you. And also the internet is a wonderful source, not only Googling about a particular plant to find out exactly what it needs, how it grows, but also to possibly order it online. It would be great for you to be able to visit the learning garden where you can see all of the trees and shrubs we talked about. The learning garden is located at the Buncombe County Master Gardener Extension Office, 50 Mount Colony. Feel free to visit 9 to 5 Monday through Friday, and you can enjoy all 8 of the gardens on site. And then on Monday and Wednesday mornings, you can actually see the Master Gardeners at work, and you can visit and ask specific questions about the plants that you may be interested in. These are the sources for the 10 plants that we talked about today. And you can access these and find out very detailed information about the various plants and how to grow them, where they grow best, different conditions that may be ideal. NC State, I would highly recommend their plant toolbox for very specific information about plants that you may be interested in growing in your own gardens. If you need help or have any questions about any of the plants we've talked about, feel free to call the Garden Help line Monday and Wednesday, 10 to 2, and Friday from 10 to noon, for any questions or concerns you may have about these plants. Do we have any more questions?
Well, as a matter of fact, let's see. On the ruby spice, you mentioned it being good on slopes. And are there others in this group that you're talking about that would be suitable for slopes, growing on slopes?
Yeah, I did see that question. The coralberry is another excellent steep slope plant simply because of the way it forms colonies. Interesting question. You could plant all of these trees on a steep slope, but if any of you live on a steep slope and have tried to do that, to try to plant, you realize how difficult it can be, both to plant it correctly, particularly if you have a slope where you can't really position the tree in an upright position without almost digging a well around it. So depends on how persistent you want to be when it comes to planting things. There was a question about vitex, and that was one of the trees I wanted to go back and talk about a little bit more. As gardeners, we're always looking for that true blue flower, and vitex is definitely a true blue. It's a fast growing shrub, and you can, as this photograph shows, you can limb it up and create a beautiful canopy, or you can let it leaf out, branch out all the way to the ground. And this is what we've done with our vitex at the Learning Garden. It's very drought tolerant once it's established. And what that means, and it can be confusing, but anytime you plant something new, you really need to pay attention for the first couple of years, particularly if we have dry periods, which we still do, even with the amount of rain we tend to have. You need to pay attention for the first couple of years. And then once it's established, you tend to be okay. The foliage on the vitex is very aromatic and has kind of a silvery cast. One thing that I've been asked when people look at this plant is, why is it called the chase tree? If you Google it, this is a really interesting storyline. It was actually named in medieval Europe. It was grown as a medicinal plant to actually instill purity in women. It was thought that a potion made from the flowers would cure an overactive libido. Modern science does not attribute much to that. As far as the use of vitex, it can be used in a variety of ways. I've seen it used as a hedge. It makes a very dramatic hedge. A single specimen obviously works very well. You can trace the history of this tree back almost 2,500 years. Different medicinal attributes have been attributed to it. It continues to be studied, and even in today's medicine, it's used in holistic science today, and you can find vitex supplements in just about any health store across the country. So many of the plants we've talked about do have medicinal and other uses. So it's kind of fun to go into Google and just do a deep dive into what a lot of these plants are all about. Any other questions that have come across? I saw a question about ordering online. The only time I order online now is if there's something I can't find locally. I've gotten to a point in my plant career where I just have a problem with something that's a few inches big or tall, whether it's an age thing or I just want instant gratification. I don't tend to mail order plants at all. We have so many great local nurseries, both native oriented and nurseries that sell a little bit of everything, that I highly recommend you try to find it locally.
Somebody asked about the fringe tree. Would you consider that a four-season plant?
It's an interesting tree when it blooms in the spring, mid-spring. It does have an interesting bark structure, but probably not really a four-season, maybe a two-season tree. But it's a great native. It's a great native, and there are fringe trees available in all of our local nurseries.
Ralph, when you were talking about the vitex, did you talk about pruning? There's a question about, did you like prune up in order to show the trunk? Did you remove those lower limbs?
Yeah, the reason to to prune up on a vitex would be to show the structure. And the other thing, if you look at this photograph, if you don't prune it up, you're going to have foliage all the way to the ground. And this is obviously planted so that you can see the border landscaping and the background. So it's kind of personal choice. I would say the same thing about crepe myrtles. We talked about crepe myrtles, but you know, you tend to want to buy a crepe myrtle that's multi-trunked, so that as it grows, you can, you know, see through it, walk under it. It doesn't really block your landscape, and then you can appreciate that beautiful bark and color in the winter. So there are reasons to limb up and reasons not to limb up, depending on where the plant is in your landscape.
Okay. What about beautyberry? Would you consider that being a four season?
Yeah, beautyberry, we have two different types of beautyberry in the learning garden. We have the Oriental type, and then we also have the native beautyberry. The thing I like about beautyberry is it does bloom in midsummer and attracts pollinators. It also doesn't really start coloring until about now. So you get that wonderful sort of late summer in the fall interest, and it's very popular with wildlife. So it's a great shrub. There are beautyberries available now. We have one in the Four Seasons garden that is a new introduction from Tom Rainey that has a more intense berry count, and the foliage is dark purple, almost black. So there are variations of beautyberry now available. But yeah, I would consider beautyberry a four-season shrub.
Okay, a question came in about the chase tree. Can you do that pruning in the fall?
My rule of thumb on pruning is anytime after a hard freeze, which depending on where you live in Buncombe County can be early November, mid-October to end of November. I do most of my pruning after a hard freeze. If you prune it quite a bit, you're not going to have the winter interest on the seed pods. So I tend to leave the top of it alone until spring, and then I may go in and do some pruning. But again, it's so many of these trees and shrubs, you know, you can grow as a shrub or you can limb it up and tree form it. So it's kind of fun if you're in the pruning to be able to work with a plant like that.
So, and then what about the berries? Do birds eat those? Are they attractive to
On the chase tree?
Yeah.
No, you don't really see much interest from the birds on the chase tree because the seed pods are, that's a good question, but I haven't really noticed much activity from birds on the chase tree.
Okay.
More so pollinators when it's in bloom, spring and summer. It is a pollinator magnet. It will be absolutely covered with pollinators when it's in bloom. And it is fragrant.
Somebody's asking about the beautyberry, the new variety.
Yes, I actually happen to remember the name of this cultivar, and I've seen it for sale in local nurseries. It's called Pearl Glam.
Say that again?
Pearl, as in pearls around the neck, Pearl Glam, G-L-A-M. And this is a beautyberry too, that the berries are much smaller, and it's an interesting shrub. Again, full sun to produce the best berry count, but I would grow it just for the sort of reddish purple foliage.
And we're talking about the American beautyberry, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, somebody has Pearl Glam. The berries are beautiful, they say. So that's nice. The hardiness zone for the learning garden is exactly, we'll have to look that up to give you a specific.
Yeah, I saw another question about planting beautyberry on steep slopes.
Okay.
Yes, I have got it planted on steep slopes, and the Oriental variety tends to volunteer here and there. So the other thing about beautyberry, I tend to prune mine almost to the ground in late winter, early spring. And by the time it comes back out and blooms, it's already 3 or 4 feet tall. So it blooms on the new growth. So you can be very aggressive in pruning your broody berries. They do get quite large.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I think that covers us for today, Ralph. Anything else that you want to share with us this morning?
Gosh, if I wanted to say one thing, it'd be, don't be afraid to try new plants, unusual plants. And I think we all learn by putting something in the ground, and don't always depend on the experts to know what it will do, particularly new introductions. Because I can still remember years ago planting a black lace elderberry, one of the first ones that was introduced to the market. And it was supposed to be small shrub, well, not small shrub, large shrub. I noticed probably 4 or 5 years later, anything that grows 4 feet in one season is not a small shrub. So when you make mistakes, it's usually because perhaps the breeders didn't even know what would happen. But the problem with that is you end up putting it in the wrong place and having to move it. So there's nothing wrong with experimenting and seeing what works and seeing what doesn't work. That's kind of what gardening is all about. If you pay attention to the basic principles.
That's great, Ralph. Thank you so much. I did put in the hardiness zone for the learning garden is 7A, and I put the link into the chat box for an interactive hardiness zone map where you can put in your zip code and it'll actually find your specific location. So you can find the zone, hardiness zone for your specific area. Ralph, I want to thank you so much for such a great program this morning. I want to thank everybody for joining us. It's been a really good, informative program. I did invite people to put in comments or topics that they might like to hear for next year, because we are doing our planning for 2022 education outreach. Wanted to let you know that we do have a couple of more programs coming up. The season's not over yet. Saturday, September 25th, growing and preserving herbs with specific culinary uses. And then our next Gardening in the Mountains is October 21st, Garden Conifers and Evergreens with Bruce Appledorn. So we're looking forward to that. And we hope everybody has, did I say October 21st? Yeah, for Garden Conifers and Evergreens. So everybody have a great day. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you soon.